Suspecting the truck driver was stealing, the millionaire searched the truck cabin and froze when he found a photo. It was the same photo of his beloved who disappeared 27 years ago. The 18-wheeler's engine roared like a caged beast as it pulled into the Stanton Transportation headquarters at dawn. Richard Stanton stood at his corner office window on the 15th floor, watching the parade of trucks that made him one of the most powerful men in American freight. At 55, he commanded respect through fear, admiration through success, and loyalty through cold, hard cash. The Roadway Emperor, they called him. He'd heard the whispers in truck stops from coast to coast. Some said it with reverence, others with barely concealed hatred. Richard didn't care which. Respect and fear served the same purpose in his world. His reflection stared back from the floor-to-ceiling glass. Steel gray hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to perfection, and eyes that had seen too much to ever look truly content. Those eyes had built an empire, crushed competitors, and made Fortune 500 executives sweat during negotiations. But they'd never stopped searching. 28 years, 28 goddamn years since Evelyn had vanished into thin air like smoke from a diesel exhaust pipe. Richard turned from the window and walked to his mahogany desk, each footstep echoing in the spacious office. His fingers found the brass frame hidden behind his computer monitor, the same photo he'd carried for nearly 3 decades, Evelyn at 7 months pregnant, her hand caressing her swollen belly, radiant with the kind of happiness that seemed to glow from within. Her smile could have powered every truck in his fleet. "Morning, boss." His secretary's voice crackled through the intercom, jolting him back to reality. "Morning, Patricia." He slid the photo back into its hiding spot. "What's on the schedule?" "Board meeting at 9. The Memphis route expansion needs your approval, and Jake Morrison from the Denver depot called. Says it's urgent." Richard's jaw tightened. Jake Morrison had been with the company for 15 years, one of his most reliable depot managers. If Jake said it was urgent, it usually meant trouble. "Get him on the line." The phone rang twice before Jake's gravelly voice filled the office. "Mr. Stanton, we've got a situation here. 3 of our drivers quit yesterday, and 2 more called in sick. We're looking at delayed shipments across the entire Rocky Mountain corridor. Why are they quitting?" Richard's voice carried the edge that had earned him his reputation. "Money troubles mostly. These guys are drowning in debt, boss, medical bills, kids' college tuition, you name it. The base pay isn't cutting it anymore." Richard rubbed his temples. He'd built his empire on efficiency and profit margins, not charity work. Increase overtime opportunities for the remaining drivers, double shifts if necessary. "Sir, with respect, that's just gonna burn out the guys we have left. Maybe if we could look at a pay increase." "Jake," the single word carried enough weight to stop a freight train. "Handle it. That's what I pay you for." The line went quiet for a moment. "Yes, sir, will do." Richard hung up and stared at the phone. This wasn't the first call like this he'd received in recent months. Drivers leaving, families struggling, loyal employees pushed to their breaking point. There was a time when he might have cared more, might have found a way to help without sacrificing his bottom line. But that was before Evelyn disappeared, before the police investigation that went nowhere, before the private detectives who took his money and delivered nothing but false hope. Before he'd learned that caring too much was a luxury he couldn't afford, his intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Stanton, there's a Valerie Carter here for the driver position. She says she has a 10 o'clock appointment." Richard glanced at his Rolex. 9:50. Send her up. He'd almost forgotten about the interview. Patricia had scheduled it after they'd received an impressive application. Clean driving record, excellent references, and most importantly, availability to start immediately, in his business. Desperation was often the best motivator. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The woman who entered his office moved with quiet confidence, her worn jeans and flannel shirt a stark contrast to the corporate luxury surrounding them. She was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Something about the way she held herself, straight-backed but not stiff, reminded him of Mr. Stanton. Her voice was steady, professional. "I'm Valerie Carter. Thank you for seeing me. Have a seat." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, studying her face. There was something familiar about the shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly when listening. But he'd interviewed hundreds of drivers over the years. They all started to look the same after a while. "I've reviewed your application," he said, opening the folder Patricia had prepared. "Impressive driving record, 7 years over the road experience. You've worked for some good companies." "Yes, sir. I believe in doing the job right. What brings you to Stanton Transportation? And be honest, I can spot bullshit from a mile away." For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but something deeper. "I've heard good things about your company. Fair routes, reliable equipment, steady work. That's what I'm looking for." Richard leaned back in his leather chair. "Fair routes," he repeated. "Interesting choice of words. Most drivers complain about our schedules being too demanding. I'm not most drivers." The simple statement hung in the air between them. There was steel beneath her calm exterior, the kind of determination he recognized because he'd built his empire on it. But there was something else too, a shadow in her eyes that spoke of old pain, carefully hidden. "The position is yours if you want it," he said finally. "Base pay is 48 cents per mile plus fuel bonuses. You'll be running the Southern Corridor, Dallas to Atlanta, sometimes pushing down to Miami. Long hauls, tight deadlines. That works for me. You start Monday. Patricia will get you set up with HR and equipment assignment." He stood, extending his hand. "Welcome to Stanton Transportation, Miss Carter." Her handshake was firm, her skin warm against his palm. For just a moment, as their eyes met, Richard felt a jolt of recognition so strong it nearly staggered him. But then she was pulling back, thanking him professionally, and the moment passed. After she left, Richard stood at his window again, watching the late morning traffic crawl through downtown. Something about Valerie Carter bothered him, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him during the interview, not with the usual mix of nervousness and desperate need most job applicants displayed, but with something that looked almost like calculation. He shook his head and returned to his desk. Patricia was right. He was getting paranoid in his old age. The woman needed a job. He needed a driver. End of story. But as he picked up the next file, his fingers brushed against the hidden photo frame. Somewhere out there, his child would be 27 years old now. If the baby had survived, if Evelyn had lived long enough to give birth, if, the endless questions that had haunted him for 28 years, Richard Stanton had built an empire on the American highway system, commanded respect from coast to coast, and amassed wealth beyond most people's dreams. But he'd trade it all for just 5 minutes with the family he'd lost, for one chance to explain why he'd gotten involved with the wrong people, for the opportunity to be the man Evelyn had believed he could be. The intercom buzzed, jolting him back to the present. "Mr. Stanton, the board meeting is starting in conference room A. On my way." He straightened his tie and headed for the door, leaving the photo and his memories behind. After all, the Roadway Emperor had an empire to run. 28 years earlier, the rain hammered against the windshield of the old Buick as Evelyn Hartwell drove through the Oklahoma night, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. Every few minutes, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following her into the darkness. Her swollen belly pressed against the seatbelt, and the baby kicked restlessly. As if sensing her fear, she'd left everything behind in Chicago. Her apartment, her job, her entire life, with nothing but a suitcase and the terrible knowledge of what Richard Stanton really was. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man whose child she carried, wasn't the legitimate businessman he'd pretended to be. 3 nights ago, she'd answered his phone while he was in the shower. The voice on the other end had been discussing drug shipments, routes through the Midwest, and payoffs to keep law enforcement looking the other way. When Richard had emerged from the bathroom and seen her face, he'd known she'd heard everything. "Evie, baby, I can explain." But there was no explaining away what she'd learned. Richard Stanton Transportation wasn't just moving legitimate cargo across America's highways. They were moving something far more dangerous, and the man she loved was at the center of it all. Now, 7 hours later and 300 miles from Chicago, Evelyn pulled into a truck stop in Tulsa, her gas tank nearly empty and her heart breaking. She'd driven south without a plan, knowing only that she had to get as far away as possible from the man who'd made her an accessory to his crimes, simply by loving him. The truck stop was nearly deserted at 2 a.m. Evelyn filled her tank with shaking hands, counting the crumpled bills in her wallet. $43. Not enough to get much farther, certainly not enough to start over, as she replaced the gas cap. A sharp pain shot through her lower back. She gasped, gripping the car door for support. The baby wasn't due for another 2 months, but the stress and fear of the past few days had taken their toll. "You okay, honey?" Evelyn looked up to see a middle-aged woman approaching from a beat-up pickup truck. She had kind eyes and calloused hands, the weathered face of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. "I'm fine," Evelyn lied, trying to straighten up. Another pain hit, stronger this time. The woman studied her with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of trouble. "No, you're not. When's your baby due?" "Not for 2 months," Evelyn's voice cracked. I needed to get away from Chicago. Running from the father." Evelyn nodded, tears finally spilling over. He's not who I thought he was." "The woman, Margaret Hayes." She introduced herself, didn't ask for details. Instead, she helped Evelyn into her pickup truck and drove her to a small house on the outskirts of Tulsa. Margaret had been a midwife for 30 years, delivering babies in rural Oklahoma, where doctors were scarce and hospitals were hours away. "You can stay here until the baby comes," Margaret said simply. "After that, we'll figure out what's next." For 6 weeks, Evelyn lived in Margaret's spare bedroom, helping with household chores when she could, and slowly regaining some measure of peace. She called in sick to her job in Chicago, then eventually quit over the phone. She didn't contact Richard, though she wondered daily if he was looking for her. Margaret never pushed for details about Evelyn's past, but gradually, the story came out. The romance that had seemed like a fairy tale, Richard's charm, his success, his promises of a future together, and then the devastating discovery that the man she loved was involved in something that could destroy them both. "Some men get lost," Margaret said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the Oklahoma sky. "Question is whether they're worth finding again." Evelyn placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby move. "I don't know anymore. I thought I knew him, but maybe I never did." The labor started on a Tuesday morning in late September. It came fast and hard, weeks earlier than expected. Margaret worked through the complications with steady hands and whispered prayers. But Evelyn's body had been pushed beyond its limits by stress and heartbreak. She held her daughter for exactly 17 minutes. "She's beautiful," Evelyn whispered, tracing the baby's tiny fingers. The little girl had Richard's dark hair and what would clearly be his strong jawline, but her eyes were all her mother's, deep brown and full of quiet intelligence. "What will you name her?" Margaret asked softly. "Grace," Evelyn said without hesitation. "Grace Evelyn." She pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. Promise me you won't let him find her. He's not a bad man, but he makes bad choices. I don't want her caught up in that world." Those were among the last coherent words Evelyn spoke. The complications that had started during labor worsened rapidly. By Thursday morning, baby Grace was an orphan, and Margaret Hayes was left with a choice that would define both their lives. She could contact Richard Stanton, tell him his daughter had survived even though Evelyn hadn't, or she could protect the child from a father whose world was built on dangerous ground. Margaret chose protection. She registered the baby as Valerie Carter, using the name of a distant relative who died years earlier, as far as the world was concerned. Grace Stanton had never existed. Present day, Valerie Carter stood in her small apartment bathroom, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Tomorrow was her first day working for her father, though Richard Stanton had no idea who she really was. On the counter beside the sink lay 2 items that had traveled with her everywhere for the past 27 years. A faded photograph of a pregnant woman with a radiant smile, and a delicate gold chain with the letter E hanging from it. Margaret Hayes had raised her with stories about both her parents, the mother who died protecting her, and the father who was a dangerous man who made bad choices. For 27 years, Valerie had wondered about Richard Stanton. Was he really the monster Margaret had described? Or was he simply a man who'd lost his way? Margaret had died 3 months ago, but not before revealing the full truth about Valerie's identity and her father's empire. The old woman had been adamant in her final days. "Stay away from him, child. Some wounds are better left alone." But Valerie couldn't stay away. She had to know who Richard Stanton really was. Had to see if the man Margaret feared was worth her mother's sacrifice. So she'd created a new identity, crafted a believable backstory, and applied for a job with Stanton Transportation. The interview that morning had been both easier and harder than she'd expected. Easier because Richard clearly had no suspicion of who she was. Harder because seeing him face to face had stirred emotions she wasn't prepared for. He looked older than she'd imagined, more weathered. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. When he'd shaken her hand, she'd seen something in his expression, a flicker of recognition that had made her heart race, but it had passed quickly, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined it. Now, alone in her apartment, Valerie picked up her mother's photograph. "I'm going to find out who he really is, Mom," she whispered. "And if he's the monster Margaret said he was, I'm going to make sure he pays for what he put you through." She fastened the chain around her neck, tucking the E pendant beneath her shirt where it rested against her heart. Tomorrow, she would begin working for the father who'd never known she existed. Tomorrow, she would start gathering evidence of his crimes, just as her mother had done all those years ago. But tonight, as she prepared for sleep, Valerie couldn't shake the memory of the sadness she'd seen in Richard Stanton's eyes. For just a moment during the interview, he'd looked like a man carrying an unbearable weight. She wondered if part of that weight was her. Monday morning arrived with the rumble of diesel engines and the sharp bite of October air. Valerie pulled into the Stanton Transportation Depot at 5:30 a.m., her breath forming small clouds as she stepped out of her weathered Honda Civic. The massive facility stretched across several city blocks, rows of gleaming 18-wheelers, fuel islands, maintenance bays, and a driver's lounge that buzzed with activity even at this early hour. She'd spent the weekend studying every detail she could find about her father's company: financial reports, news articles, employee reviews on trucking forums. What she'd discovered painted a picture of a man who'd built his empire through ruthless efficiency and an iron fist. "You must be the new girl," a gravelly voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see a stocky man in his 50s approaching, his Stanton Transportation uniform stretched tight across his barrel chest. "I'm Tommy Rodriguez, dispatch supervisor. Mr. Stanton said you'd be starting today." Valerie Carter. She shook his calloused hand, noting the wariness in his eyes. New drivers were always viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves. "Come on, I'll show you around. Coffee's fresh in the lounge if you need it. You're gonna need it." The driver's lounge was a study in controlled chaos. 24 men and women in various stages of preparation for their routes. Some gulping coffee and studying route sheets, others checking equipment or catching up on paperwork. Valerie noticed immediately how quiet the conversations were, how quickly they stopped when Tommy approached. "Listen up, everybody," Tommy announced. "This is Valerie Carter, our new driver. She'll be running the Southern Corridor." A few nods, a couple of mumbled greetings, then the drivers returned to their business. But Valerie caught the looks they exchanged. Sympathy mixed with something that looked like pity. "Friendly bunch," she said quietly to Tommy as he led her toward the equipment yard. "They're good people," Tommy replied, his voice lower now. "Just careful. Things have been tough around here lately." "Tough how?" Tommy stopped walking and looked around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Look, I've been with this company for 12 years. Mr. Stanton pays well, equipment's reliable, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not the same man he used to be. Used to care about his drivers, these days. It's all about the bottom line." They reached her assigned truck, a gleaming Peterbilt with Stanton Transportation emblazoned across the cab. Despite everything, Valerie felt a surge of professional pride. It was a beautiful machine, well-maintained and powerful. "She's all yours," Tommy said, handing her the keys. "Your first load goes out at 7, Dallas to Atlanta. Pick up Thursday morning for the return trip. Standard route, nothing fancy." As Tommy walked away, Valerie climbed into the cab and took a moment to familiarize herself with the controls. The leather seats still smelled new. The dashboard was spotless, and every gauge was in perfect working order. Whatever else Richard Stanton might be, he took care of his equipment. Nice ride. Valerie looked down to see a woman in her 40s standing beside the truck. She had short gray hair, laugh lines around her eyes, and the confident posture of someone who'd been driving trucks longer than Valerie had been alive. "Thanks, I'm Valerie. Maria Santos. Been driving for Stanton for 8 years. Maria's expression grew serious. "Word of advice. Keep your head down and your mouth shut, mister. Stanton doesn't like drivers who ask too many questions. What kind of questions? Maria glanced around nervously. The kind about why good drivers keep quitting. The kind about why families are losing their homes while the company reports record profits. The kind about why we're running loads that don't quite add up. Valerie's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Loads that don't add up. Nothing, Maria said quickly, stepping back from the truck. I don't mean anything, just be careful, okay? And if you ever need anything, find me. Us drivers got to look out for each other. The morning progressed with equipment checks, route planning, and paperwork. Valerie learned the rhythm of the depot, the carefully choreographed dance of trucks coming and going, loads being transferred, and drivers managing their tight schedules. But she also noticed the undercurrent of tension that ran through every interaction. During her lunch break, she sat in the driver's lounge and listened to conversations around her. What she heard broke her heart. Doctor says my wife needs surgery, one driver was telling another. $20,000. Insurance covers half. But where am I going to get the other 10 grand? Company used to have an emergency fund, his companion replied quietly. Back in the day, Mr. Stanton would help drivers in tough spots. Those days are long gone. At another table, a younger driver was on his phone. I know, baby. I know the mortgage is past due. I'm working extra shifts, but it's not enough. Maybe if I pick up some independent loads on weekends. Valerie found herself studying these men and women. Hard-working people who were struggling despite being employed by one of the most successful transportation companies in the country. The disconnect between the company's obvious wealth and its employees' financial struggles was jarring. That afternoon, she made her first delivery run to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The load was standard, auto parts bound for Atlanta, but the warehouse itself caught her attention. It was newer than most, with high-end security systems and employees who seemed unusually nervous around company trucks. First time here? Asked the loading dock supervisor, a thin man with darting eyes. Yeah, everything looked right with the paperwork. Oh, sure, just make sure you stick to the route Tommy gave you. No detours. No unauthorized stops, mister. Stanton's real particular about that. On the drive back to the depot, Valerie's mind churned with questions. Margaret Hayes had painted Richard as a criminal, but what she was seeing looked more like cold corporate greed than active criminality. Still, there were odd details. The nervous warehouse workers, the emphasis on specific routes, Maria's cryptic warnings about loads that didn't add up. That evening, she returned to her apartment and opened her laptop. If her father was still involved in illegal activities, there would be traces, financial irregularities, unusual shipping patterns, connections to questionable businesses. She'd spent years learning how to research, how to follow paper trails and uncover hidden connections. But first, she had a more immediate plan to put into action. She'd seen the faces of the drivers today, heard their stories of financial hardship. If Richard Stanton wouldn't help his employees, maybe Valerie Carter could find a way to do it for him. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing down names. The driver whose wife needed surgery, the younger man facing foreclosure, the single mother Maria had mentioned who was working double shifts to pay for her daughter's college tuition. All good people caught in the machinery of corporate indifference. The plan formed slowly in her mind. She would monitor the company's financials, look for opportunities to redirect small amounts that wouldn't be missed from the overall budget, but could make a real difference to struggling families. It wouldn't be stealing, she told herself. It would be justice. Her mother had died because she'd discovered Richard's crimes. If he was still the same man who'd driven Evelyn away, then he deserved whatever consequences came his way. And if he'd truly changed, if he was simply a man who'd forgotten how to care about anything beyond profit margins, then maybe this would remind him what really mattered. Valerie picked up the photograph of her mother, studying the radiant smile of a woman who'd sacrificed everything to protect her unborn child. I'm going to find out who he really is, Mom, she whispered. And one way or another, I'm going to make things right. Outside her apartment window, the distant rumble of trucks on the interstate provided a constant reminder of the world she'd entered. A world built on movement and momentum, where the past and present collided on endless stretches of American highway. Tomorrow, she would begin her real work. 3 weeks into her employment at Stanton Transportation. Valerie had established herself as a reliable driver and a careful observer. Her roots took her through the heart of America's freight corridors, from the sprawling distribution centers of Dallas to the bustling ports of Atlanta, and with each mile, she gathered more pieces of the puzzle that was her father. Richard Stanton was not the man Margaret Hayes had described. There were no drugs moving through his trucks, no obvious criminal enterprise, but there was something else, a coldness that seemed to permeate every aspect of how he ran his business. He paid his drivers the minimum required by industry standards, squeezed every penny from his contracts, and showed no mercy for those who fell behind. It was during her second week that Valerie began her campaign of quiet justice. The opportunity had presented itself when she'd overheard Tommy Rodriguez on a heated phone call with the accounting department. "I don't care what the budget says. Martinez has been with us for 6 years. His kid needs that surgery, and we've got the money sitting in the equipment maintenance overage account." But the accounting department had refused. Company policy, they'd said. No loans, no advances, no exceptions. That night, Valerie had accessed the company's financial system using login credentials she'd observed during her orientation. The security was surprisingly lax for a company of Stanton's size. Perhaps Richard's confidence in his control meant he'd never considered the possibility of internal threats. What she found in the accounts both amazed and disgusted her. Stanton Transportation was sitting on massive cash reserves, money that could transform the lives of every struggling employee, equipment maintenance funds that hadn't been touched in months, executive bonuses that dwarfed the annual salaries of drivers, marketing budgets for campaigns that existed only on paper. The next morning, David Martinez had received an anonymous cashier's check for $10,000 in his mailbox at home. No note. No explanation. Just enough money to save his wife's life. Since then, Valerie had made 4 more adjustments to the company's finances. Small amounts, carefully chosen from accounts that wouldn't be audited for months. The single mother facing eviction had found rent money in her locker. The diabetic driver struggling to afford insulin had received a pharmacy gift card. Each act of redistribution felt like a small victory against the system her father had built, but her activities hadn't gone unnoticed. "Patricia, get me the monthly financial reports." Richard's voice carried through his office door as Valerie passed by on her way to the dispatcher's station. It was Thursday afternoon, and she'd just returned from her Atlanta run. She slowed her pace, pretending to study a route bulletin posted on the hallway wall. "All of them, sir." Patricia's voice was strained. "All of them. And I want Jake Morrison here first thing tomorrow morning." Something's not right with these numbers. Valerie's pulse quickened. She'd been careful, but maybe not careful enough. She needed to be more strategic, more patient. But every day she saw her coworkers struggling while Richard sat in his tower of glass and steel. Counting his profits, her resolve only strengthened. "Valerie, you got a minute?" She turned to find Tommy Rodriguez approaching, his expression troubled. "Sure. What's up?" "Mr. Stanton wants to see you. Something about your route reports." Her blood went cold, but she kept her voice steady. "Did he say what about them?" "Nope. Just said to send you up when you got back." Tommy paused, studying her face. "Everything okay? You haven't been cutting corners on your logs or anything?" "No, nothing like that. My logs are clean." "Good. Because between you and me, the boss has been on edge lately. More than usual. I mean, he's been digging into everything. Driver schedules, fuel reports, maintenance records, acting like he's expecting to find something." Valerie nodded and headed for the elevator, her mind racing. What had she missed? What detail had given her away? The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like an eternity. She'd been in Richard's office only once since her interview, and that had been for a brief meeting about insurance paperwork. Now, summoned unexpectedly, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed identity was about to crumble. Patricia looked up as she approached. "He's waiting for you. Go right in." Richard was standing at his window when she entered, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared down at the depot below. He didn't turn around when she spoke. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Stanton." 3 weeks, he said quietly, still facing the window. "In 3 weeks, you've run 8 routes without a single problem. On-time deliveries, no equipment issues, no customer complaints. Impressive. Thank you, sir. Your route reports are unusually detailed, more so than most drivers bother with." Now he turned, and Valerie was struck again by the weight in his eyes. "Tell me, what do you see when you're out there on the road?" The question caught her off guard. Sir, the drivers you meet at truck stops, the warehouse workers, the people who keep this industry moving, what do you see? Valerie chose her words carefully. I see hardworking people trying to make a living. And are they succeeding at making a living? She hesitated. This felt like a trap, but there was something in his tone that suggested genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. Some are. Others are struggling. Richard moved to his desk and sat down, gesturing for her to take the chair across from him. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked. The expensive suit couldn't hide the slight slump of his shoulders, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for a file. I built this company from nothing, he said, opening the folder. Started with one truck, a bank loan I probably shouldn't have qualified for, and more determination than sense. For 28 years, I've focused on one thing: success, growth, profit. He pulled out a photograph and set it on the desk between them. Valerie's breath caught in her throat. It was her mother, young and radiant, standing beside a much younger Richard in front of a single semi-truck. I used to have different priorities, he continued, his voice growing softer. Used to believe that success meant more than just numbers on a balance sheet. Valerie stared at the photo, fighting to keep her expression neutral. She'd never seen a picture of her parents together. Her mother looked so happy, so completely in love with the man beside her. What happened? She asked, surprised by the huskiness in her own voice. Life happened. Bad choices, loss. Richard picked up the photo and studied it for a long moment. Do you know what it's like to lose everything that matters to you in a single moment? The question hung in the air between them. Valerie wanted to tell him that yes. She knew exactly what it was like, that she'd grown up knowing her mother had died alone and afraid, far from everything she'd loved. But instead, she simply shook her head. It changes you, Richard continued. Makes you hard in ways you never thought possible. You start believing that caring too much is a luxury you can't afford. He returned the photo to the folder and looked directly at her. But lately, I've been wondering if I lost more than just the people I loved. Maybe I lost the person I used to be. The vulnerability in his voice nearly undid her. This wasn't the monster Margaret Hayes had described, or the cold corporate tyrant she'd expected to find. This was a man carrying 28 years of grief and regret. A man who'd built walls so high he could no longer see over them. People can change, she said quietly. It's never too late to remember who you used to be. Something shifted in his expression as he studied her face. There's something familiar about you, Valerie. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. The way you phrase things. It's been bothering me since our first meeting. Valerie's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. I get that a lot. I guess I have one of those faces. Maybe. But his eyes remained fixed on hers, searching. Or maybe some ghosts are harder to escape than others. The conversation in Richard's office had rattled Valerie more than she cared to admit. The way he'd looked at her, the questions about familiarity, the photograph of her parents together, it all felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. She'd managed to maintain her composure, but barely. Now, 2 weeks later, Richard's scrutiny had intensified to an uncomfortable degree. He's been asking questions about you, Maria Santos warned during their lunch break at a truck stop outside Memphis. They sat in a corner booth, speaking in low voices while other drivers came and went. Tommy says he's been reviewing your personnel file, asking about your references, your driving history. Valerie's stomach tightened. Did Tommy say why? Nothing specific, but word is, the boss hired a private investigator last week. Some guy from Chicago named Peterson. The coffee in Valerie's cup suddenly tasted like ash. A private investigator meant Richard was serious about uncovering whatever he suspected. It also meant her carefully constructed identity as Valerie Carter was about to face professional scrutiny. Maybe it's about the missing money, Maria continued, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Rumor mill says there have been some irregularities in the accounts. Small amounts, but enough to get noticed. Valerie kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. She'd been so careful, taking tiny amounts from various accounts, never enough to trigger automatic alerts. But Richard Stanton hadn't built his empire by overlooking details. What kind of irregularities? She asked. The kind that helped people like Danny Martinez pay for his wife's surgery. The kind that kept Sarah Williams from losing her apartment. Maria's eyes narrowed slightly. Funny thing is, nobody's complaining about it. Makes you wonder if whoever's behind it is doing God's work. That afternoon, Valerie returned to the depot to find Richard waiting in the dispatch office. He was standing beside Tommy's desk, studying route assignments with the intensity of a man looking for hidden codes. "Ms. Carter," he said without looking up, "how was the Memphis run? Smooth? On schedule? No problems?" "No problems," he repeated, finally raising his eyes to meet hers. "That seems to be your specialty. In 6 weeks of employment, you've had exactly 0 incidents. No traffic delays, no mechanical issues, no customer complaints. That's unusual for a driver, even an experienced one." Valerie shrugged. "I'm careful. I plan ahead. Or you're very good at avoiding situations that might require improvisation." The comment felt loaded with meaning she couldn't quite decipher. Tommy looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers on his desk while pretending not to listen. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss, Mr. Stanton?" Valerie asked. "Actually, yes." He picked up a clipboard and handed it to her. "I'm reassigning you to a new route, Chicago to Denver, with a stop in Kansas City. You'll be carrying specialized equipment for a manufacturing company." Valerie glanced at the route sheet. Chicago, the city where her parents had met, where her mother had discovered Richard's criminal activities, where everything had gone wrong 28 years ago. "Any particular reason for the change?" "Call it a test," Richard said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I want to see how you handle different types of cargo." That evening, Valerie drove home through the autumn darkness, her mind churning with possibilities. Was this assignment random? Or was Richard deliberately sending her to Chicago to see how she'd react? And what did he mean by different types of cargo? She parked outside her apartment and sat in the Honda for several minutes, studying the shadows between buildings. Was that investigator already watching her? Had she been careful enough with her digital footprints when creating the Valerie Carter identity? Inside her apartment, she pulled out her laptop and began researching Peterson investigations in Chicago. What she found made her blood run cold. Marcus Peterson specialized in corporate security and background verification, with a reputation for uncovering even the most carefully buried secrets. Her phone rang, startling her from her research. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello, Valerie Carter." The voice was professionally neutral. "Yes, this is Marcus Peterson. I'm calling on behalf of Stanton Transportation regarding some routine verification of employment records." Valerie's mouth went dry, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of verification?" "Standard procedure for certain positions. I'll need to confirm some details from your previous employers. Would it be possible to schedule a brief interview? I'm scheduled for a long haul tomorrow. I'll be on the road for several days." "Of course. When would be convenient upon your return? I'll have to check my schedule and get back to you." "Certainly. Have a safe trip, Ms. Carter." The line went dead, leaving Valerie staring at her phone. Peterson's call confirmed her worst fears. Richard was actively investigating her background. How long before he discovered that Valerie Carter's employment history was an elaborate fiction? She opened her laptop again and began working frantically. Bank records, social security information, employment history. Every piece of the identity she'd constructed needed to be bulletproof against professional scrutiny. She worked until 3 a.m, reinforcing her fake background with additional documentation and carefully planted digital breadcrumbs. The next morning, she arrived at the depot early to prep her truck for the Chicago run. The cargo was indeed unusual. Precision manufacturing equipment bound for aerospace contractors, high-value, sensitive merchandise that required special handling and security protocols. As she conducted her pre-trip inspection, Richard appeared beside her truck. He was dressed casually, jeans and a Stanton Transportation polo shirt, but his presence felt anything but casual. "Mind if I ask you something personal, Valerie?" She continued checking tire pressure, not trusting herself to look at him directly. "Depends on how personal. Do you have family? People who worry about you when you're on the road?" The question caught her off guard. "Not really. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by a family friend. That must have been difficult." "Growing up without knowing your real family?" There was something in his tone that made her look up sharply. He was studying her with that same intense focus she'd noticed before, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for weeks. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "but the woman who raised me was good to me. She told me stories about my parents, kept their memory alive. What kind of stories? That my mother was beautiful and kind. That she died too young. Valerie met his eyes directly. That my father was complicated. A man who'd lost his way. Something flickered across Richard's face. Pain. Recognition. Or perhaps just imagination. And what did you think about that? About having a father who'd lost his way? I thought maybe everyone deserves a second chance to find their way back. They stood there for a long moment. The morning air thick with unspoken questions and half-revealed truths. Finally, Richard stepped back. Drive carefully, Valerie. The roads to Chicago can be dangerous, especially when you're carrying valuable cargo, as she pulled out of the depot. Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's final comment had been a warning about more than just highway safety. The way he'd emphasized Chicago, the pointed questions about her family. Everything suggested he was closing in on the truth. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to Stanton Transportation to uncover her father's secrets, but it seemed he was equally determined to uncover hers. The question was, which one of them would succeed first? The Chicago skyline rose like steel monuments against the gray November sky as Valerie guided her 18-wheeler through the city's industrial corridors. She'd been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing through Missouri and Illinois with barely a break, driven by a restless energy she couldn't quite name. Being back in Chicago felt surreal. This was where her parents had met, where they'd fallen in love, where everything had gone wrong. The streets looked different than she'd imagined from Margaret's stories, more crowded and harsh, but she could almost feel the ghosts of their past in every passing block. The delivery address took her to a manufacturing facility on the south side, a sprawling complex of warehouses and machine shops that hummed with industrial activity. As she backed up to the loading dock, Valerie noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Several other Stanton Transportation trucks were already there, their drivers unloading cargo under the watchful eyes of security guards. "First time here?" asked the dock supervisor as Valerie climbed down from her cab. "Yeah, busy place. Mr. Stanton's got a good contract with us. Regular shipments, always on time." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're new, aren't you? Don't remember seeing you before." 6 weeks on the job," Valerie replied, trying to sound casual. Still learning the routes. As the dock workers unloaded her cargo, she watched the other Stanton drivers. They moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something different about their demeanor. More alert, more cautious than the typical freight delivery. When one of them made eye contact with her, he looked away quickly, as if he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. "All set," the supervisor announced, handing her the signed delivery receipt. "Safe travels." Valerie was walking back to her truck when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Small world, isn't it? She turned to find Richard Stanton approaching across the parking lot, his expensive overcoat flapping in the cold wind. He looked completely out of place among the industrial equipment and blue-collar workers, but his presence explained the unusual tension she'd sensed. "Mr. Stanton, I wasn't expecting to see you here. I like to check on important contracts personally," he said, stopping just close enough to make the conversation feel intimate. "How's the truck running? Any problems on the road?" "No problems. She handles beautifully." Good. His eyes swept across her face, searching. "Tell me, what do you think of Chicago?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Valerie sensed layers of meaning beneath it. "It's bigger than I expected. More complicated." Complicated. That's one way to put it. Richard moved closer, his voice dropping. "This is a city of secrets, Valerie. Old stories that people would rather forget. Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with you when you least expect it." A chill ran down Valerie's spine that had nothing to do with the November cold. "Is there something specific you want to tell me, Mr. Stanton? Just a piece of advice? Be careful who you trust. In this business, in this city, not everything is what it seems." Before she could respond, he was walking away, leaving her standing in the parking lot with more questions than answers. The return trip to Kansas City should have been routine, but Valerie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every truck that followed her for more than a few miles made her nervous. Every rest stop felt like a potential trap. She made her scheduled stop in Kansas City to pick up return cargo, auto parts bound for Atlanta, but something felt off about the transaction. The warehouse worker seemed nervous. The paperwork took longer than usual, and when she asked about the delay, The supervisor gave her a vague answer about inventory verification. It wasn't until she was back on the highway, studying her route in the truck's GPS system, that she realized Richard had set her up. The return route he'd assigned was completely different from her usual corridors. Instead of the direct interstate highways she normally traveled, this route took her through smaller cities and rural areas, the kind of places where unusual cargo movements would be less likely to attract attention. Margaret's warnings echoed in her mind. What if Richard hadn't changed as much as she'd hoped? What if she'd just become an unwitting participant in whatever illegal activities had driven her mother away all those years ago that night? Parked at a truck stop outside Springfield, Missouri, Valerie made a decision that would change everything. She climbed into the trailer to inspect her cargo. The auto parts looked legitimate. Boxes of brake systems and transmission components with proper manufacturer labels and shipping documentation. But as she moved deeper into the trailer, using her phone's flashlight to examine the cargo more closely, she found something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind a wall of legitimate boxes were smaller containers with no identifying marks. They were locked with high-security seals and felt surprisingly heavy for their size. Whatever was inside, it wasn't auto parts. Valerie backed out of the trailer and sat in her cab. Mind racing, she'd found evidence that Richard was still involved in illegal activities. But what should she do about it? If she reported it to authorities, she'd have to explain how she'd discovered the contraband, which would expose her true identity. But if she said nothing, she'd be complicit in whatever crime was being committed. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed Richard's personal number. "Hello. Valerie, it's Richard. How's the return trip going?" "Fine, no problems." She tried to keep her voice steady. "Good. I wanted to make sure you understood the importance of following the exact route I gave you. No deviations. No unauthorized stops. Of course, is there a reason you're concerned?" A pause. "Let's just say the cargo you're carrying is time-sensitive. Any delays could cause significant problems for our client." After he hung up, Valerie sat in the darkness of her cab, wrestling with impossible choices. If she confronted Richard about the hidden cargo, she'd have to reveal that she'd been snooping. If she completed the delivery without questions, she'd be helping him commit whatever crime was involved. But there was a third option, one that would require careful timing and considerable risk. The next morning, she made an unscheduled stop at a rest area near the Missouri-Arkansas border. While pretending to conduct a routine safety inspection, she used her phone to photograph the hidden containers and their unusual security seals. If she couldn't stop whatever Richard was doing, at least she could document it. As she prepared to get back on the road, another Stanton Transportation truck pulled into the rest area. The driver, one of the men she'd seen at the Chicago warehouse, approached her with purposeful strides. "You okay?" he asked, but his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. "Saw you had your trailer open. Just checking the load securement," Valerie replied. "Standard procedure." The driver, his uniform name tag read Collins, studied her for a long moment. "Mr. Stanton's real particular about this route, likes his drivers to stay on schedule." "I'm on schedule." "Good, wouldn't want there to be any misunderstandings." As Collins walked back to his truck, Valerie realized she was trapped in more ways than one. Richard wasn't just testing her loyalty, he was having her watched, ensuring she followed his instructions exactly. The web of suspicion and control was tightening around her with every mile. She climbed back into her cab and pulled onto the highway, the hidden cargo weighing on her conscience like lead. Whatever Richard Stanton was smuggling in those unmarked containers, she was now an unwilling accomplice to his crimes. The daughter had become what she'd spent her entire life believing her father to be, a criminal running contraband across America's highways. The Atlanta delivery had gone smoothly. Too smoothly. The unmarked containers were unloaded by workers who asked no questions and provided no paperwork, disappearing into a warehouse that looked more like a fortress than a legitimate business. Valerie had completed her unwitting participation in whatever crime her father was orchestrating, and the weight of that knowledge sat heavy in her chest as she drove back toward home base. It was 3 a.m. when she pulled into the Stanton Transportation Depot. The facility was nearly deserted, just a skeleton crew of night dispatchers and maintenance workers. Valerie parked her truck in its assigned spot and began her post-trip routine, checking equipment and securing the cab for the night. She was exhausted, emotionally drained from days of wrestling with impossible moral choices. All she wanted was to go home, take a long shower, and figure out what her next move should be. But as she gathered her personal items from the cab, she realized she'd left her driver's logbook in the trailer. The logbook contained her official record of the trip. Hours driven, rest periods, fuel stops. It was required documentation that had to be turned in to dispatch, grumbling under her breath about her own carelessness. She walked around to the back of the trailer and opened the doors. That's when she heard footsteps in the gravel behind her. Couldn't sleep either. Valerie spun around to find Richard emerging from the shadows between two parked trucks. He was dressed in dark clothes, his usual business attire replaced by jeans and a black jacket, in the dim light of the depot's security lamps. He looked younger somehow, more like the man in the photograph with her mother. "Mr. Stanton, you startled me." She tried to keep her voice calm. "I just need to get my logbook." At 3 a.m, he moved closer, and she could see something different in his eyes, a mixture of determination and desperation that made her take an unconscious step backward. Most drivers would wait until their next shift to worry about paperwork. "I like to stay organized." "Organized," he repeated, the word carrying an edge of suspicion. "Is that what you call it?" Before she could ask what he meant, Richard brushed past her and climbed into the trailer. Valerie's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard him moving around inside, clearly searching for something specific. "Mr. Stanton, what are you—" "Looking for evidence," he said, his voice echoing from inside the trailer. "Evidence of theft." Valerie's blood turned to ice. Had he somehow discovered her financial manipulations? But then she heard him curse softly, and she realized he was looking in the wrong place for the wrong crime. "The money that's been disappearing from company accounts," Richard continued, his voice growing more frustrated. "Small amounts, carefully taken from various budgets. I know someone's been stealing from me, and I'm going to find out who." The irony of the situation would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. Richard suspected her of the one crime she had actually committed. While she suspected him of crimes he might not have committed at all, they were circling each other in a dance of mutual deception, each hiding their true motivations. "I don't know anything about missing money," Valerie said, trying to sound convincing. "No." Richard's voice was getting closer. "Then maybe you can explain why you've been so interested in learning about our financial systems. Why you've been asking questions about employee hardships and company policies. I care about my coworkers. Or maybe you care about finding opportunities to steal from them." Richard emerged from the trailer empty-handed, his expression dark with frustration. But as he stepped down from the loading dock, something caught his eye. A small metal box that had been hidden behind Valerie's personal items in the cab. "What's this?" He reached for the box before she could stop him. "That's personal." But Richard had already opened it, and the contents spilled into the harsh fluorescent light of the depot. The photograph of her mother, pregnant and radiant, the gold chain with the letter E, the birth certificate that listed her real name as Grace Stanton. Time seemed to stop. Richard stared at the photograph in his hands, his face draining of color. His fingers trembled as he picked up the chain, holding it up to the light as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "This is impossible," he whispered. "This photo? I have the exact same one? And this necklace?" His voice cracked. "I gave this to Evelyn the day I found out she was pregnant." Valerie watched 28 years of carefully constructed composure crumble before her eyes. The powerful businessman, the feared Roadway Emperor, reduced to a broken man holding the remnants of a love he'd lost. "Where did you get these?" Richard demanded, but his voice was barely above a whisper. Valerie had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, all her planned words evaporated. "She was my mother." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Richard's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, hope, and finally, devastating recognition. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. My baby died with Evelyn. They both died 28 years ago. She didn't die in the car accident like you thought. She made it to Oklahoma. She gave birth to me, but she died from complications." Valerie's voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "A midwife named Margaret Hayes took me in, gave me a new name, and raised me." Richard sank against the side of the trailer, the photograph clutched against his chest. "You're Grace," he whispered. "You're my daughter. I'm the daughter you never bothered to look for hard enough." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. I searched for you for years. I hired investigators, followed every lead, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to find you and your mother. But you never found us, because Margaret made sure you couldn't. She was protecting me from you, protecting you from me." Richard's voice was raw with pain. "Why would she need to protect you from your own father? Because she knew what you were, what you'd been involved in. She knew about the drugs, the criminal activities that made my mother run away in the first place." Richard stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Drugs? What are you talking about? The smuggling operation? The reason Mom fled Chicago when she was pregnant? The reason she died alone and afraid, hundreds of miles from home? Valerie, Grace, I don't know what you've been told, but I know what I found in that trailer yesterday," she interrupted, her voice rising. "The hidden containers, the unmarked cargo, you're still doing it, aren't you? Still running illegal shipments through your trucks?" Understanding dawned in Richard's eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like relief. "You think those containers held drugs? What else would they hold?" Richard actually laughed, a sound so unexpected and bitter that it made Valerie step backward. "Cash," he said. "Those containers held cash, emergency funds for drivers whose families are in crisis, money that I've been secretly distributing to employees who are struggling." Valerie felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "What? The money you've been stealing from company accounts. I've been doing the same thing, just on a larger scale. The mysterious payments that have been helping your coworkers. That wasn't you. That was me." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so certain, so convinced that Richard was the monster Margaret had described. But the evidence was crumbling around her, replaced by a truth she'd never considered. Her father wasn't the criminal she'd believed him to be. He was a man who'd lost everything 28 years ago, and had spent the decades since then trying to atone for mistakes that had cost him his family. And she, his daughter, the child he'd grieved for nearly 3 decades, had come into his life under false pretenses, stealing from him while believing she was delivering justice. "I've been looking for you my entire adult life," Richard said, his voice breaking. "And you've been here all along, hating me for crimes I never committed." The silence in the depot stretched between them like a chasm 28 years wide. Richard stood clutching the photograph of Evelyn, his body trembling with the weight of revelation, while Valerie fought to process the complete collapse of everything she'd believed about her life. "You're lying," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The pain in Richard's eyes was too raw, too genuine to be fabricated. "I wish I were." Richard's voice was barely audible. "God, how I wish I were lying about any of this." Valerie backed away from him, her mind reeling. "Margaret told me. She said you were involved with drugs, that Mom found out and had to run. Margaret Hayes." Richard's face darkened with a mixture of grief and anger. "I remember that name from the police reports. She was the last person to see Evelyn alive. She saved me. She protected me from you. She stole you from me." The words exploded from Richard with such force that Valerie flinched. "She let me believe my daughter was dead for 28 years, because she thought you were a criminal. Based on what? One phone call she might have overheard, a conversation that could have been about anything." Valerie's certainty wavered. The drug shipments were legitimate prescription medications being transported for a pharmaceutical company, perfectly legal cargo that required security protocols because of its street value. Richard's voice grew stronger as pieces fell into place. "Your mother overheard a conversation about route security, about keeping law enforcement informed of our shipments to prevent hijacking. She misunderstood what she was hearing." The truth hit Valerie like a physical blow. Margaret Hayes, the woman who'd raised her, who'd filled her childhood with stories of a dangerous father, had been wrong. Completely, devastatingly wrong. "No." Valerie shook her head frantically. "That can't be right. Margaret wouldn't have. She loved me. She was protecting me. From a father who would have given anything to hold his daughter, who spent his life savings searching for her, who built this entire company hoping that someday, somehow, she might find her way back to him." Richard sank to his knees in the gravel, still clutching the photograph in the harsh fluorescent lighting. He looked older than his 55 years. broken by the weight of decades spent grieving a loss that had been unnecessary. "I never stopped looking for you," he whispered, even when the investigators said there was no trail to follow, even when everyone told me to move on. I kept hoping. Every young woman I hired, every driver who reminded me of Evelyn, I wondered, could this be her? Could this be my Grace? Valerie felt her legs give out. She slumped against the trailer, sliding down until she was sitting in the gravel across from her father, this stranger who shared her DNA and her loss. "You suspected," she said numbly. "You knew there was something familiar about me. From the first day, the way you moved, the way you thought. You have your mother's expressions, her intelligence, her stubborn streak." A broken laugh escaped him. "You even have her sense of justice. When I realized money was being taken from company accounts to help struggling employees, I wasn't angry. I was proud. It was exactly something Evelyn would have done. You knew I was stealing from you. I knew someone was redistributing company funds to workers who needed help. And when I realized it might be you, I started my own investigation. Not to expose you, but to understand why." Richard looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I thought maybe you were like your mother, someone who couldn't stand to see suffering when she had the power to help." The irony was unbearable. Valerie had spent weeks convinced she was stealing from a corporate tyrant, when in reality she'd been competing with her own father's secret charity. "The private investigator," she said, "Peterson. I hired him to verify what I suspected, that Valerie Carter was an assumed name, that your background was manufactured. I thought maybe you were running from something, needed help." Richard's voice cracked. "I never imagined you were running from me." Valerie pulled her mother's necklace from her shirt, holding the golden E in her palm. "Such a small thing to carry the weight of so much misunderstanding. She died thinking you were a criminal," she said quietly. "She died alone and afraid because she thought she was protecting me from you. And you grew up believing your father was a monster who'd driven away the woman he loved." They sat in the gravel of the depot parking lot, surrounded by the sleeping giants of the trucking fleet, both of them destroyed by the same tragedy from opposite directions. "I came here to destroy you," Valerie admitted. "I wanted to find evidence of your crimes, expose you, make you pay for what I thought you'd done to my mother. Instead, you found a broken old man who spent 28 years punishing himself for losing the only family that ever mattered to him." The raw honesty in his voice finally broke through Valerie's defenses. The tears she'd been holding back for weeks, for years, came in a torrent that left her gasping. "I hate you," she sobbed, but the words carried no conviction. "I've hated you my entire life. It was easier than missing you." Richard crawled across the gravel toward her, moving slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Grace, don't call me that." The name came out like a scream. "Grace died with my mother. Grace was the daughter you could have had if you'd tried harder to find us, if you'd been the man she needed you to be." "You're right." Richard stopped just out of arm's reach, respecting her pain even as his own threatened to consume him. "I wasn't the man she needed. I was young and stupid, and so focused on building something successful that I forgot what success was supposed to mean. She loved you." The words came out broken, mixed with tears and 28 years of suppressed grief. "Even at the end, even when she was running from what she thought you were, she still loved you. Margaret told me that. She said Mom's last words were about hoping you'd find your way back to being the man she fell in love with." Richard's composure finally shattered completely. He bent forward, his forehead touching the gravel, and wept with the abandon of a man who'd held back tears for nearly 3 decades. "I tried," he said through his sobs. "After I lost you both, I tried to be better. I stopped the risky contracts, cleaned up every aspect of the business, tried to become worthy of her memory, but it was too late. You were already gone." Valerie watched her father break down in a truck yard at 3 a.m, this powerful man reduced to his most fundamental grief. And despite everything, the years of anger, the weeks of deception, the lifetime of believing he was her enemy, she felt something shift inside her chest. "We found each other," she whispered. "Even with all the lies and misunderstandings and lost time, we found each other." Richard looked up at her, his face streaked with tears and gravel dust. "Can you forgive me? Can you forgive a father who failed to protect his family? who lost his daughter before he even knew her name? Valerie didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The question was too big, carried too much weight. Instead, she reached across the space between them and placed her mother's photograph in Richard's hands, covering his fingers with her own. "We're going to figure this out," she said. Together, dawn was breaking over the Stanton Transportation depot. By the time Richard and Valerie moved their conversation from the gravel parking lot to his office, they sat across from each other, not as employer and employee now, but as father and daughter trying to bridge 28 years of separation with words that felt inadequate to the task. Richard had made coffee, his hands still trembling slightly as he poured 2 cups. The corporate emperor who commanded respect through fear and intimidation was gone, replaced by a man who looked fragile enough to shatter at the wrong word. "Tell me about her," Valerie said quietly. "Tell me about my mother, the real version, not the stories Margaret told me." Richard's eyes softened as he settled back in his chair, the photograph of Evelyn placed on the desk between them like a bridge connecting past and present. "She was magnificent," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Not just beautiful, though she was that, but alive in a way that made everyone around her feel more alive too. She had this laugh that could fill a room, and when she was passionate about something, she'd get this fire in her eyes." He paused, studying Valerie's face. "You have that same fire. I saw it during your interview. Saw it when you talked about caring for your coworkers. I should have recognized it then." What was she passionate about? Justice, fairness. She couldn't stand seeing people suffer when she had the power to help. Richard smiled sadly. "She used to volunteer at a homeless shelter on weekends, when I complained that she was spending too much time there. She told me that success without compassion was just elaborate selfishness." Valerie felt a strange mixture of pride and grief. "Margaret told me she was kind, but she always emphasized how she had to run from you. Every story ended with fear. Fear based on a misunderstanding that cost us everything." Richard's jaw tightened. "I've spent 28 years wondering what I could have done differently. If I'd been more transparent about my business, if I'd explained the security protocols better, if I'd convinced her to trust me. She was pregnant and scared. She thought she was protecting our child." "Our child." Richard repeated the words as if testing their weight. "Do you know how many times I've imagined what it would be like to say that, to have a daughter to worry about, to be proud of, to love?" The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable. Valerie had spent so long preparing to hate this man that she didn't know how to process this version of him. Broken, grieving, desperate for connection. "I'm not easy to love," she said carefully. "I'm stubborn, suspicious, and apparently I have a talent for completely misreading situations. You're cautious. You protect yourself after what you've been through. That makes perfect sense." Richard leaned forward. "But Grace, Valerie, you're also brave enough to seek out the truth, even when you thought it might destroy you. You're compassionate enough to steal from what you believed was a corrupt company to help struggling families. You're your mother's daughter in every way that matters. And yours too, apparently. Margaret always said I had a ruthless streak when I was fighting for something I believed in. Guilty as charged, I built this company through sheer stubbornness and refusal to accept defeat." Richard's expression grew serious. "Which brings us to the question of what happens now." Valerie had been dreading this conversation. The emotional reunion was one thing, but the practical reality of their situation was far more complicated. "I lied to you," she said bluntly. "I used false documents to get hired, stole money from your accounts, and spent weeks planning to destroy your reputation. That's not exactly the foundation for a healthy father-daughter relationship. And I investigated you, had you followed by a private detective, and put you in a position where you unknowingly became part of my secret charity operation." Richard shook his head. "We're both guilty of deception, but yours was motivated by suspicion and concern. Mine was motivated by revenge. Was it?" Richard challenged gently. "Or was it motivated by a daughter's need to understand her father, to know whether the man who gave her life was worthy of forgiveness?" The question hung in the air between them. Valerie had told herself for months that she wanted revenge, but now she wondered if what she'd really wanted was permission to love the father she'd never known. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be someone's daughter. Margaret was good to me, but she wasn't. She couldn't replace what I'd lost. I don't know how to be someone's father either, Richard replied. I missed everything. First steps, first words, birthdays, Christmas mornings, high school graduation. I don't have any of the experiences that create those bonds. But we have time now, if we want it. Richard's eyes filled with tears again. I want it more than I've ever wanted anything, but I need to know that you want it too. Not out of obligation or pity, but because you genuinely believe we can build something real. Valerie looked at the photograph of her mother, at the woman who had loved Richard Stanton enough to carry his child, who had died believing she was protecting that child from him. What would Evelyn want for her daughter now? I'm angry, Valerie said slowly, at Margaret for keeping us apart, at circumstances for being so cruel, at myself for wasting weeks hating you when I could have been getting to know you. But I'm not angry at you anymore. That's a start. It's more than a start, it's everything. Valerie reached across the desk and picked up the photograph. Mom died believing she was doing the right thing. I can't change that, but I can choose to do the right thing now, which is learning to be your daughter, teaching you to be my father, figuring out how to honor her memory by building the family she would have wanted us to be. Richard stood up suddenly and walked to the window overlooking the depot. The facility was coming alive with the morning shift. Drivers preparing for their routes, mechanics checking equipment, dispatchers coordinating the complex ballet of American freight transportation. I've spent 28 years building this company, he said without turning around. It was supposed to be my legacy, the thing I'd leave behind to prove that Richard Stanton had mattered. But now I realize it was just a monument to my grief. It doesn't have to be, Valerie said, joining him at the window. It could be something else, something that would make Mom proud. How? By becoming what it should have been from the beginning. A company that cares about its people as much as its profits. A place where families like the one we could have been are supported and protected. Richard turned to look at her. And for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled, really smiled, with warmth and hope, and something that looked remarkably like pride. You want to help me transform this company. I want to help you become the man Mom fell in love with, the man she believed you could be again. Valerie met his eyes directly. But I want to do it honestly this time. No more false identities, no more secrets. If we're going to be family, we need to trust each other. No more secrets, Richard agreed. Starting now. They stood together at the window, watching the sun rise over the empire Richard had built from grief and stubbornness. It wasn't the reunion either of them had imagined. It was messy and complicated and born from mutual deception. But it was real. And for two people who had spent decades believing they were alone in the world, that was enough to build on. 6 months later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Stanton Transportation depot as Valerie pulled her 18-wheeler into the loading bay. But this wasn't the same facility she'd first entered 9 months ago, as a desperate woman seeking revenge. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. Newer equipment, improved driver facilities, and most importantly, the sound of laughter echoing from the driver's lounge. "Morning, boss," Tommy Rodriguez called out as she climbed down from her cab. The title had evolved naturally over the past few months, as Valerie had taken on more responsibility in the company operations. "Morning, Tommy. How's the new driver orientation going?" "Better than expected. Having you and your dad both involved in training makes a real difference. These folks know they're working for people who actually understand what it's like on the road." Valerie smiled at the casual way Tommy referred to your dad. The relationship between her and Richard had grown slowly, carefully, built on small moments of trust and understanding rather than grand gestures. They were still learning each other's rhythms, still discovering shared mannerisms and inherited stubbornness, but it felt real in a way she'd never experienced before. She found Richard in his office, but it wasn't the sterile corporate space she remembered from her first interview. The walls now displayed driver appreciation awards, photos from company family events, and prominently featured a framed picture of Evelyn that no longer hid behind a computer monitor. "How was the Denver run?" Richard asked, looking up from a stack of insurance claims. At 56, he looked younger than he had 6 months ago, as if the weight of 28 years of grief had finally begun to lift. "Smooth, no problems." Valerie settled into the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd sat as a nervous job applicant. hiding her true identity. Maria Santos asked me to thank you for the bonus program. Her daughter's college tuition is covered for next semester. It's not charity, Richard said firmly, though his eyes showed pleasure at the news. Good drivers deserve good benefits. I should have figured that out years ago. The transformation of Stanton Transportation had been gradual but comprehensive. Driver pay increases, expanded health coverage, emergency assistance funds, profit-sharing programs, changes that had initially horrified the accounting department, but had resulted in the lowest employee turnover rate in the company's history. Speaking of benefits, Valerie said, pulling a folder from her bag, I have the preliminary numbers on the driver wellness program, and accident rates are down 15%, insurance claims are down 20%, and driver satisfaction surveys are the highest they've ever been. She grinned. Turns out treating people well is actually good for business. Richard laughed, a sound that still surprised Valerie with its warmth. Your mother would have told me the same thing 28 years ago if I'd been smart enough to listen. They'd found a way to talk about Evelyn now without drowning in grief. She had become a presence in their lives rather than an absence, her memory informing their decisions and inspiring their better angels. There's something else, Valerie said, her tone growing serious. I got a call from Marcus Peterson this morning. Richard's expression darkened slightly. The private investigator had become an unwelcome reminder of the mistrust that had nearly kept them apart. What did he want? To return the remainder of his retainer? He said he'd completed his investigation and wanted to deliver his final report in person. An hour later, Peterson sat in Richard's office looking distinctly uncomfortable. He was a professional investigator, used to delivering difficult news, but this situation was clearly outside his normal experience. I have to say, this is the strangest case I've ever worked, he began, opening his briefcase. You hired me to investigate an employee you suspected of theft, and I ended up documenting one of the most remarkable stories of family separation and reunion I've ever encountered. He placed a thick folder on Richard's desk. Valerie Carter doesn't exist. You were right about that, but Grace Evelyn Stanton very much does, and her story is exactly what she told you. Margaret Hayes did raise her, did tell her those stories about her father, and did die believing she was protecting the child from a dangerous man. Peterson paused, studying both Richard and Valerie. What I can't figure out is how you both ended up being better people than either of you had any right to be, given the circumstances. We had good teachers, Valerie said quietly. My mother taught my father about compassion, even if he didn't understand the lesson until it was too late. And Margaret Hayes, for all her mistakes, taught me about protecting the people you love. The financial irregularities that started this whole investigation, Peterson continued. Those were acts of kindness, not theft. Both of you were secretly helping employees in need. You were stealing from each other to give to the same people. Richard and Valerie exchanged a look that spoke of shared amusement at the absurdity of their situation. There's one more thing, Peterson said, reaching into his briefcase again. I tracked down some of Margaret Hayes' personal effects. The woman who bought her house found this and thought someone in the family might want it. He handed Valerie a worn leather journal. She opened it carefully, recognizing Margaret's handwriting on the first page. It's a diary, she said softly. She wrote about me, about raising me. Her voice caught as she read further, about the guilt she carried for keeping us apart. Richard leaned forward. What does it say? Valerie read aloud. Grace asks about her father more often now. She's 17 and starting to question my stories about him being dangerous. The truth is, I've spent years watching the news, reading about Richard Stanton's company, and I'm beginning to wonder if I made a terrible mistake. He doesn't look like a criminal in those business magazine articles. He looks like a man who's lost everything. The room fell silent as the weight of Margaret's words settled over them. She knew, Richard said finally. She suspected she'd been wrong. Valerie continued reading. If I've kept a father and daughter apart based on a misunderstanding, I'll never forgive myself. But Grace is almost grown now, and if I tell her the truth, she might try to find him. What if I'm wrong again? What if he really is dangerous? I can't risk her safety, but I also can't stop thinking about the possibility that I've robbed them both of something precious. She died still wrestling with it, Valerie said, closing the journal. Still trying to protect me, even from her own doubts. Peterson packed up his briefcase. For what it's worth, I think she'd be proud of how this turned out. You both honored what she tried to teach you. You protected each other, even when you didn't know that's what you were doing. After Peterson left, Richard and Valerie sat in comfortable silence, processing the final pieces of their complicated puzzle. "Do you think we would have found each other eventually?" Valerie asked. "Even without all the deception and investigation?" Richard considered the question. "I think we were both looking for the same thing. Family, forgiveness, a way to honor your mother's memory. Maybe that would have drawn us together somehow. Or maybe we needed all the complications to appreciate what we found. Maybe." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the depot that had become more than just a business. It was a legacy they were building together. "Your mother used to say that the best journeys are the ones that bring you home, even when you didn't know you were lost." Valerie joined him at the window, holding Evelyn's photograph in one hand and Margaret's journal in the other, artifacts of two women who had shaped her life in different ways. "Are we home now?" she asked. Richard put his arm around her shoulders, the gesture still tentative but growing more natural each day. "We're getting there, Grace. We're getting there." Outside, the trucks rolled on, carrying their cargo across the highways of America. But inside the glass tower of Stanton Transportation, a father and daughter stood together, no longer searching for what they'd lost, but grateful for what they'd found.